The veterinary clinic on 8th Avenue smelled like disinfectant and fear. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the front desk, scrolling through appointment reminders on her tablet when the automatic doors slid open. A woman in her mid-30s entered, moving with the careful precision of someone navigating an invisible minefield. Her right hand gripped a white cane that swept methodically across the tile floor. Her left hand rested on the harness of a golden retriever whose vest read, "Guide dog, do not pet." Sarah looked up from her screen, her practiced smile already in place. The woman stopped 3 feet from the counter, and the dog sat immediately, its brown eyes fixed forward with professional focus. "Good afternoon," Sarah said, keeping her voice warm but not overly cheerful. "Do you have an appointment?" "Yes, 3:15 for Bella," the woman replied. Her voice carried the flat affect of someone who'd answered these questions 1,000 times before. "Routine checkup." Sarah tapped her screen, found the appointment, and nodded, even though she knew the gesture was useless. "Perfect. I've got you right here, Ms. Hernandez. We'll be ready for you in just a few minutes." If you're watching this for the first time, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment telling us where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. Maria Hernandez settled into one of the waiting room chairs, and Bella positioned herself precisely at her handler's feet. Sarah watched them for a moment, struck as she always was by the seamless communication between guide dog and handler. She'd been a veterinarian for 11 years, specializing in working dogs, and the bond still amazed her every single time. 15 minutes later, Sarah called them back to examination room 3. She ran through Bella's checkup with methodical thoroughness: heart rate, temperature, ears, teeth, joints. The retriever submitted to each examination with patient dignity, occasionally glancing at Maria as if to confirm this was all still acceptable. "She's in perfect health," Sarah said, making notes in the digital chart. "You're doing an excellent job with her care." "She takes care of me more than I take care of her," Maria said, and there was something in her voice, a tightness, a tension that made Sarah pause. "Is everything okay?" Maria's jaw worked for a moment before she spoke. "My sister's getting married in 3 months. San Francisco. I'm supposed to be her maid of honor." She paused, her fingers finding Bella's ears and stroking them absently. "But I don't know if I can do it. The travel, the unfamiliar venue, all those people. Even with Bella, it feels like too much." Sarah set down her tablet. She'd heard variations of this conversation before, the quiet confession of limitations that most people took for granted. The world was built for the sighted, and every deviation from that norm required planning, energy, and courage that exhausted even the most independent blind individuals. "Have you talked to your sister about your concerns?" "She keeps saying it'll be fine, that she'll make sure I'm taken care of." Maria's laugh was hollow. "I don't want to be taken care of. I want to participate. I want to stand beside her without feeling like everyone's watching to see if I'll trip or knock something over or make a mistake." Sarah didn't have easy answers, but she recognized the voice of someone who needed to be heard more than advised. They talked for another 10 minutes before Maria and Bella left, the guide dog navigating them through the clinic's corridors with practiced ease. That evening, Sarah drove home to her apartment in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. The November sun had already set, casting the city in that particular urban twilight where streetlights competed with neon signs and car headlights. She parked in her building's cramped lot and climbed 3 flights of stairs to her 1-bedroom apartment. Inside, she kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto her second-hand couch. Her cat, Marzipan, emerged from the bedroom and jumped onto her lap with a demanding meow. Sarah scratched behind the cat's ears and pulled out her phone, scrolling mindlessly through social media while her mind drifted back to Maria Hernandez and that conversation about the wedding. The truth was, Sarah had been thinking a lot lately about the limitations of guide dogs. Not their training or dedication. Those were beyond reproach. But there were situations, environments, emotional landscapes that even the best guide dog couldn't fully navigate for their handler. She'd seen it in her clients over the years, that gap between independence and isolation that no amount of mobility training could completely bridge. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Lauren. "Dinner tomorrow? Thai place on Franklin?" Sarah typed back a confirmation and set her phone aside. Marzipan had fallen asleep in her lap, purring like a small engine. Through the thin walls, she could hear her neighbor's television, the muffled dialogue of some crime drama bleeding through the plaster. Outside, a siren wailed past, probably heading toward the hospital 6 blocks away. She thought about Maria again, about that quiet desperation in her voice, about wanting to participate rather than be accommodated. About the difference between those two things, and how rarely people understood that difference mattered. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the clinic 20 minutes early. She liked this time before the day officially started, when she could prepare her examination rooms and review the day's schedule without interruption. Her first appointment was at 9, a German Shepherd with a suspicious limp. At 10:30, she had a meeting with a local K9 unit about their annual wellness checks. The afternoon was packed with routine appointments and 2 surgeries. But at 8:45, the front desk called back to her office. "Dr. Mitchell, there's someone here to see you. No appointment. Says it's important." Sarah walked to the front desk and found herself face to face with a man in his late 50s, wearing work boots and a canvas jacket stained with what looked like motor oil. He held a cardboard box with air holes punched in the sides. "Dr. Mitchell." His voice carried the rough edges of someone who'd spent years shouting over machinery. "Name's Frank Rodriguez. I work at the auto shop on 3rd. Found something this morning I think you should see." He set the box on the counter and opened the top flap. Inside, curled on a bed of shop rags, was a border collie puppy. It couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, all black and white fur and oversized paws. But what struck Sarah immediately was the puppy's eyes. They were clouded, milky white with just the faintest hint of blue underneath. The puppy turned its head toward the sound of voices, but its gaze didn't track or focus. "Found her behind the dumpster when I opened up this morning," Frank said. "I think she's blind." Sarah reached into the box carefully, speaking softly as she lifted the puppy. It squirmed in her hands, small and warm and unexpectedly solid. She carried it back to an examination room, and Frank followed. Under the bright lights, Sarah conducted a thorough examination. The puppy's eyes showed signs of congenital cataracts, severe enough that she doubted the dog had ever seen clearly. But aside from the blindness, the puppy appeared healthy. Good weight, no signs of malnutrition or abuse, strong heartbeat, responsive to sound and touch. "Someone probably dumped her because of the eyes," Frank said, his voice thick with disgust. "Didn't want to deal with a blind dog." Sarah felt the familiar anger rising in her chest. She'd seen it too many times. Animals abandoned because they didn't meet someone's arbitrary standard of perfection. But beneath the anger was something else, something that had been building since her conversation with Maria Hernandez yesterday. "I'll take her," Sarah said. Frank looked relieved. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'd take her myself, but my landlord's already on me about the cat I'm not supposed to have." After Frank left, Sarah sat in the examination room with the puppy in her lap. The little border collie had fallen asleep, her breathing deep and even. Sarah ran her fingers through the soft puppy fur and felt an idea beginning to take shape. Something audacious and probably impossible, but persistent enough that she couldn't quite dismiss it. Border collies were working dogs, bred for intelligence and trainability. This puppy, despite her blindness, had already shown signs of both. When Sarah had clapped her hands, the puppy had oriented toward the sound immediately. When Sarah had placed her on the floor, The puppy had explored cautiously but methodically, using her nose and ears to build a map of her surroundings. What if, Sarah thought, a blind service dog could understand the experience of blindness in a way that sighted guide dogs, no matter how well trained, never could? What if there was something in that shared experience, that navigation of a world built for vision, that could create a deeper level of partnership? She pulled out her phone and started researching. Service dog training programs, requirements for guide dogs, success rates, washout statistics. The more she read, the more her initial excitement began to temper itself with reality. Blind dogs as service animals were virtually unheard of. The few cases she could find online were either unverified anecdotes or assistance dogs for deaf individuals, where the dog's blindness didn't impact their primary function. But guide dogs for the blind were different. They needed to navigate obstacles, assess dangers, make split-second decisions about safe paths through crowded environments. How could a blind dog do any of that? Sarah looked down at the sleeping puppy. As if sensing Sarah's gaze, the puppy's ear twitched, and she made a small sound in her sleep. Something between a whimper and a sigh. "What am I thinking?" Sarah whispered to the empty examination room. But the idea wouldn't let go. Over the next week, Sarah kept the puppy at the clinic during the day and brought her home at night. She needed to name her, she realized, even if this was temporary. She settled on Scout, partly because the puppy was constantly exploring, and partly because of the literary reference to someone who saw the world clearly, despite others' blindness. Scout adapted to her environment with remarkable speed. Within 3 days, she'd memorized the layout of Sarah's apartment. Within a week, she'd learned the clinic well enough to navigate from the front desk to the examination rooms without bumping into anything. She used her other senses with an intensity that sometimes startled Sarah. The way Scout would freeze and tilt her head at the sound of a door opening 3 rooms away, or how she could identify people by the sound of their footsteps. Sarah started reading everything she could find about canine cognition, spatial awareness in blind dogs, compensation strategies. She reached out to colleagues, posted questions in veterinary forums, and made calls to service dog training programs across the country. Most of the responses ranged from skeptical to dismissive. A blind guide dog was a contradiction in terms, they said. It was impractical. It was potentially dangerous. It was, in the kindest assessments, a nice thought that simply wouldn't work in reality. But one response stood out. Dr. James Chen, a veterinary behaviorist in Seattle who specialized in working dogs, sent Sarah a long email that began with, "This is either the worst idea I've ever heard or the most brilliant, and I honestly can't tell which." They scheduled a video call for the following Tuesday evening. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with Scout sleeping at her feet and her laptop open in front of her. Dr. Chen appeared on screen, a man in his 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an office full of certificates and photos of dogs. "So," Dr. Chen said, leaning back in his chair, "tell me about this puppy." Sarah explained everything, how Scout had been found, her condition, the behaviors Sarah had observed. She talked about Maria Hernandez and the conversation that had sparked this whole impossible idea. She talked about the gap between accommodation and participation, and her growing conviction that maybe, just maybe, a blind service dog could bridge that gap in ways a sighted dog never could. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Here's what I know," he finally said. "Traditional guide dog training wouldn't work. Scout can't see obstacles, can't assess traffic, can't make visual judgments about safe passage. But," he leaned forward, "what if we're thinking about this wrong? What if Scout isn't meant to replace traditional guide dogs, but to complement them? Or what if we're looking at an entirely different kind of assistance?" Sarah's kitchen felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in as Dr. Chen's words hung in the air between them through the laptop screen. Scout stirred at Sarah's feet, let out a small yawn, and settled back into sleep. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled past, its hydraulic brakes hissing as it stopped at the corner. "What do you mean by different kind of assistance?" Sarah asked, leaning closer to the screen. Dr. Chen pulled off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, a gesture Sarah would come to recognize as his thinking habit. Traditional guide dogs are mobility aids, right? They're trained to navigate physical space safely. But there's a whole category of service work that's more about emotional support and specific task work. Psychiatric service dogs, for instance, or dogs trained to alert to seizures or blood sugar changes. "I'm familiar with those," Sarah said carefully. "But I'm not seeing how Scout fits into that category. She's not trained and she's blind." "Exactly." Dr. Chen put his glasses back on. "She's blind. She navigates the world without vision. She's developed compensatory strategies that most sighted dogs never need to develop. What if those strategies are exactly what could make her valuable?" Sarah ran her hand through her hair, trying to follow his logic. "You're saying her blindness is an asset?" "I'm saying it could be in the right context. Look, I'm not suggesting Scout could ever do what a traditional guide dog does. But think about the psychological aspect of disability. The isolation, the feeling that no one, not even your service dog, truly understands what you're experiencing. A blind person with a blind service dog. There's a shared experience there that might create a different kind of bond." Scout woke up and stretched, her small paws extending as she yawned again. She stood, shook herself, and then began exploring the kitchen with her usual careful method. Nose down, moving in expanding circles, mapping the space through scent and sound, and the subtle air currents that told her when she was approaching a wall or furniture. "Watch her," Sarah said, turning the laptop so Dr. Chen could see. "She's memorized this apartment. She knows where everything is. And if I move something, she figures it out within a few minutes." Dr. Chen watched Scout's progress across the kitchen floor. "How does she do with new environments?" "Cautious at first, but she adapts quickly. Yesterday I took her to a friend's house. Within an hour, she was navigating the living room like she'd been there her whole life." "Remarkable." Dr. Chen made some notes on something off-screen. "Okay, here's what I'm thinking. There's a woman I know in Portland, Oregon, Dr. Elizabeth Hartford. She runs an experimental service dog program focused on what she calls non-traditional partnerships. Dogs with physical disabilities paired with handlers who understand those limitations. She's had some success with a 3-legged dog and a handler who's a bilateral amputee, a deaf dog working with a deaf handler. She's pairing disabled dogs with disabled handlers. Not as a gimmick," Dr. Chen said firmly, "as a genuine exploration of whether shared experience creates stronger working bonds. Her research suggests it might. The handlers report feeling more understood, less judged. The dogs seem to have lower stress levels. It's preliminary stuff, but it's compelling." Sarah felt something ignite in her chest. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Possibility, maybe. "Do you think she'd be interested in Scout?" "I think she'd be fascinated. But Sarah, you need to understand something." Dr. Chen's voice turned serious. "This isn't a guaranteed path. Even if Dr. Hartford agrees to work with Scout, even if we can find the right handler, there's no guarantee this will work. Service dog training has a 40% washout rate even with ideal candidates. With Scout, the odds are probably worse." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because I've seen people get attached to an idea like this. They invest everything in it, and when it doesn't work out, it destroys them. If you're going to pursue this, you need to be prepared for failure." Scout had completed her exploration of the kitchen and returned to Sarah's feet. She sat down and looked up, not at Sarah's face, because she couldn't see it, but toward the general direction of Sarah's presence, guided by sound and scent. "I'm prepared," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "What's the next step?" Dr. Chen promised to reach out to Dr. Hartford and get back to Sarah within the week. After they ended the call, Sarah sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the dark laptop screen. Marzipan wandered in and gave Scout a suspicious look before retreating to the bedroom. Scout, oblivious to the cat's disdain, curled up at Sarah's feet and went back to sleep. The next few days passed in a blur of routine veterinary work, punctuated by moments of watching Scout navigate the world. Sarah found herself studying the puppy with clinical attention, noting every adaptation, every learned behavior. Scout had developed a specific head tilt she used when listening intently, processing acoustic information with remarkable precision. She'd learned to recognize people by their footsteps, Sarah's quick stride, the mailman's heavy boots, the upstairs neighbor's shuffling gait. The rain came down in steady sheets that October morning, drumming against the windows of the small ranch house on the outskirts of Billings, Montana. Sarah Mitchell sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she held them in her lap. A constant reminder of how much her life had changed in the 6 months since the accident. The doctors had used careful words: traumatic brain injury, permanent vestibular damage, cognitive impairment. What it meant in practice was that Sarah, at 32 years old, could no longer drive, could barely walk without stumbling, and sometimes forgot entire conversations she'd had just hours before. The seizures came without warning, dropping her to the ground wherever she happened to be standing. She'd lost her job as a veterinary technician. She'd lost her independence. She'd lost the version of herself she'd spent 3 decades building. Before we continue with Sarah's story, I'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and I'm grateful to share this journey with you. The accident itself remained a blur. Witnesses said a pickup truck had run a red light at the intersection of Grand Avenue and 27th Street, T-boning her Honda Civic at 45 miles per hour. Sarah remembered pulling up to the light. She remembered the song on the radio, something by the Lumineers. Then nothing, until she woke up in St. Vincent Healthcare with her sister Emma holding her hand, tears streaming down her face. "You're alive," Emma had whispered. "That's all that matters." But alive felt like a generous description for what Sarah had become. She was a passenger in her own life now, dependent on Emma for groceries, for rides to endless medical appointments, for help remembering to take the arsenal of medications that kept her seizures somewhat controlled. The walls of her small house, which she'd bought with such pride 4 years ago, had become the boundaries of her entire world. The isolation was the worst part. Her friends from work had visited at first, bringing casseroles and flowers and uncomfortable small talk. But the visits had tapered off as the months wore on. People didn't know what to say to someone whose entire life had been derailed. Sarah didn't blame them. She wouldn't have known what to say either. She was contemplating another long day of daytime television when she heard Emma's car in the driveway. Her sister had a key and let herself in, calling out as she entered. "Sarah, I brought lunch, and I want to talk to you about something." Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, shaking rain from her jacket. At 38, she was 6 years older than Sarah, with the same dark hair and green eyes, but a steadiness that Sarah had always envied. Emma had her life together: a husband, 2 kids, a good job as a nurse practitioner. She'd put her own life on hold these past months to take care of Sarah, and the guilt of that ate at Sarah daily. "You don't have to keep doing this," Sarah said, the same thing she said every time Emma showed up. "I'm fine." "You're not fine, and that's okay," Emma replied, setting a bag from Burger Dive on the table. "But I think I might have found something that could help." Sarah looked up, trying to muster interest. Emma had been full of suggestions lately: support groups, therapy programs, experimental treatments. Sarah had tried to be open-minded, but nothing had made any real difference. "There's an organization called Summit Service Dogs," Emma continued, pulling out her phone and sitting across from Sarah. "They train service dogs specifically for people with conditions like yours: seizure alert dogs, mobility support, that kind of thing. I've been researching them, and Sarah, their success rate is incredible." "I don't need a dog," Sarah said automatically. The thought of taking care of an animal when she could barely take care of herself seemed absurd. "Actually, I think you do. Listen to this. These dogs can detect seizures before they happen, sometimes minutes before. They can help with balance and mobility. They're trained to get help if you fall. Some of them can even remind you to take medication." Emma's eyes were bright with the kind of hope Sarah hadn't felt in months. "The application process is pretty involved, and there's a waiting list, but I already contacted them. They want to do a phone interview with you next week." Sarah wanted to shut down the conversation, to retreat back into the numb resignation that had become her default state. But something in Emma's expression stopped her. Her sister had been her lifeline these past months, never complaining, never pulling away even when it would have been easier to do so. "Okay," Sarah heard herself say. "I'll do the interview." The relief on Emma's face made Sarah's chest tight. When had she become someone who needed to be managed, convinced, carefully handled? The question hurt too much to examine closely. The phone interview happened on a grey Tuesday afternoon. The woman on the other end of the line was named Patricia, and she had a warm, no-nonsense voice that immediately put Sarah at ease. They talked for over an hour about Sarah's medical history, her daily challenges, her living situation, her goals for the future. "What would independence look like for you?" Patricia asked. Sarah had to think about it. She'd become so focused on what she'd lost that she'd stopped imagining what she might still gain. "Being able to walk to the mailbox without being terrified I'll fall," she finally said. "Being able to go to the grocery store, maybe getting a job again someday, even if it's something small. Just being able to live without feeling like I'm about to break at any moment." "Those are achievable goals," Patricia said. "I'm going to recommend you for our program. The waiting list is currently 6 to 8 months, but I'm going to see if we can expedite your application. Your case is exactly the kind of situation where a service dog can make a transformative difference." 6 to 8 months felt like forever. But it was also the first deadline Sarah had to look forward to in half a year. She marked it on the calendar Emma had hung in her kitchen, a small act that felt oddly significant. The months that followed developed a rhythm. Emma continued her regular visits. Sarah attended physical therapy twice a week, slowly building back strength and balance. The seizures continued, unpredictable and terrifying, but she learned to recognize some of her triggers: stress, lack of sleep, flickering lights. She started a journal at her neurologist's suggestion, tracking her symptoms and moods. In April, 7 months after her initial interview, Patricia called. "We have a dog for you," she said, and Sarah's heart did something it hadn't done in a long time. It leaped. The dog's name was Scout, a 3-year-old border collie who had been in training for 18 months. Patricia explained that border collies were extremely intelligent, intensely focused, and naturally attuned to their handler's emotional and physical state. Qualities that made them excellent service dogs for people with conditions like Sarah's.